DSLRs, mirrorless, point and shoot, we got a collection of $500 cameras on the table.
Let's find out which one is best for photos and video.
This video is brought to you by Squarespace. You can save 10% off your first purchase at squarespace.com/photorectv. Hi, I'm Toby, and I call myself a photographer.
Hi, I'm Kaz, and I'm primarily a videographer.
And we've got this group of cameras that come in at about a $500 price point, and we want to talk about them from a photography perspective.
And a video perspective.
So I invited Kaz on, who's typically behind the camera. Thanks for sitting down with me, Kaz.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. So why $500 though? Why is that the magic number, Toby?
Well, I thought it would look really good on a YouTube title.
There you go.
500. But no, more seriously, it's the price point at which I think you can start to pick up a pretty serious camera that gives you room to grow. Under $500, there are a lot of sacrifices to be made, and it's difficult to find a new camera at that price point that we can really recommend. Used, we'll talk about a little bit later in this video.
All right, so I guess without further ado, let's jump into the DSLRs.
We've got the Nikon D3500. It's an APS-C size sensor, 24 megapixels. It's capable of doing 5 frames per second. On the video side of things, 1080 at 60p, which is impressive. Probably the headline feature of this Nikon is its battery life, over 1,500 shots per charge. From Canon, we've got the Rebel T6. This is also an APS-C size sensor. 18 megapixels, a little bit smaller than the Nikon, does just 3 frames per second, and its video tops out at 30 frames per second, 1080. Both of these cameras come with a zoom lens at this price point, right around $500, and the Canon throws in a bag as well.
So Toby, with all these new kinds of cameras that are out in the market these days, why would I get a DSLR?
Well, you know, there's some benefits still, even though these are the old guys. I could say that being an old guy myself. The bigger body usually feels a little bit nicer in the hand, also balances nicer if you're going to put longer lenses on. It also has room usually for a bigger battery, and so the DSLRs offer a bigger kind of battery life, and that's not just because the battery is bigger, but also because you're not using the screen all of the time with the optical viewfinder, which some people prefer still, an optical viewfinder.
And I will also say, you know, since these guys have been around for so many years, the lens selection on most of these lens mounts is quite immense. And there's no shortage of finding used lenses for most of these camera systems these days.
Right, and that's a great point. You're buying in, we're talking about affordable cameras. You also want to know that you can buy affordable lenses, and both of them have huge selections out there.
So you can get classic and new lenses. But these are the brand new models. Well, not the brand new models. These are the new models of the entry-level cameras from Canon and Nikon.
Yep.
What did you think about them?
Well, you know, I was surprised by my feelings and kind of our summary of which one was a winner for us between these two in a minute. Both of us started with Canon Rebels way back.
Yep.
It feels quite nice in the hand, but there's not that much more great I can say about that Canon. We'll get into that in a second. The Nikon grip, you know, is a little bit smaller and not quite as comfortable as the Canon, but the camera on a whole is a bit smaller as well, which is actually something I like. These days I want to travel a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter, so I appreciate that. I also hear from a lot of people who write me and say, you know, I bought X camera, but I don't want to carry around that big camera anymore. What's a smaller one you can recommend? So this kind of makes some sacrifices in the way it feels in the hand, but gives you a really nice, small, lightweight DSLR.
Yeah, I did notice that the Nikon's a little bit thinner, which creates a deeper grip versus the Canon. But, you know, when it comes to gripability, neither one of these cameras is going to be flying out of your hand when you have a good handle on it, just because it's nice to hold on to.
One thing that I really like about the Nikon, it might seem small and silly, but just like a real grown-up camera, it's got its SD card slot in the side.
versus on the bottom in the Canons, right next to the battery, just like your point and shoot.
Yeah, and that might be blocked when you have it on a tripod. So you run out of memory card when you're sitting on a tripod taking your epic astrophotography pictures or fireworks pictures or something, and then suddenly you've got to take it off the tripod to switch that out, which just slows you down a bit. We mentioned battery life being better in DSLRs. It is important to note that Nikon is fantastic at over 1,500 shots in a single battery. That's great. The Canon is about a third of that, right around 500. So a pretty significant difference there. That's nice peace of mind when you're working with a Nikon. Performance-wise, on the photo side of things, they're pretty closely matched. 24 megapixels versus 18. It sounds different. In the real world, it's not a huge difference. Image quality at various ISOs, not a huge difference. I think that I'd give a slight edge to the Nikon, but it's only a slight edge. However, on the video side of things, it's a little bit of a different story.
Usually, Canon has historically been known for their really good video on their DSLRs, all the way back to the 5D. But this one I found was majorly lacking in one very crucial aspect, which is the continuous autofocus mode that we're starting to see in a lot of these cameras. When we're shooting with the Nikon D3500, when panning over different objects, it'll continuously try to autofocus. The Canon, however, will not do that. And so when you want to focus, you have to hit the shutter button, and it will then do the So if you're going to be shooting video on this and you want to focus on something that's getting further away or coming closer, your only option is to switch it over to manual mode and then get it by hand, which, if you're not experienced shooting video like that, it can be very difficult, especially if the subject is moving quickly.
Yeah, you're more likely going to miss that focus, at least myself.
Yeah, and these guys also, since one of the big advantages of these kind of DSLRs is that larger sensor size. The APS-C size sensor is a lot bigger than what you're going to find in your phone or anything. And that creates a much more shallow depth of field. So that means, not only do you have to get focus by hand, but then it's also going to be thinner. So you have to be more accurate. Now, one last thing about the usability is these guys both have LCD screens on the back. But unlike some of the other entry-level cameras, these both do not flip out in any way. So when you're shooting yourself or you're trying to shoot down low, it can be difficult because you have to get right on with the screen to see what's going on.
There is a feature difference. This can do up to 60p at 1080. It gives you kind of that epic slow-mo, you can slow it down in post where it makes everything just look that much cooler. Limited to 1080 at 30 frames per second. And both these cameras can't record longer than 30 minutes. And actually at the 1080 and 60, you're limited to just 10 minutes at a time. So that's something to think about if you want to record your kids' play.
Yeah, so you're definitely not going to be shooting anything too long. But generally, people are just shooting quick, 1 to 2 minute bursts of video, which for that, these guys, the picture quality in the video is great and it looks fine. And these kit lenses do a great job resolving the image. It's just that lack of continuous autofocus that really knocks the Canon for me.
Yeah. So if you had to pick a winner between the two of them?
Hands down, the Nikon.
For video, and I also picked that for photos. Let's move on and talk about the mirrorless now.
So first up, we have Panasonic's Lumix G7. This guy is a 16 megapixel micro four thirds sensor, and it has burst rates up to 7 frames per second and video quality up to 4K at 30 frames per second. It also features a fully articulating touch screen. On the other side, we have the Canon M100. This guy is a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor with a burst rate of up to 6.1 frames per second and the maximum video quality at 1080p at 30 frames per second. This one also has an articulating touchscreen and features Canon's dual pixel autofocusing system.
Mirrorless, they've got some advantages over traditional DSLRs, and I think the EOS M100 really nicely illustrates that. You remove the mirror, and look at how small this camera can get, and it's still got an APS-C size sensor in here. So same as those DSLRs, but wow, this almost can fit in your pocket, and that's with the kit lens on. They also do offer a little pancake lens that really makes this nice and small. So that's one pretty significant advantage, size.
Now, also getting rid of that mirror also means that the image you see on the back LCD screen or in the electronic viewfinder, in the case of this Lumix, is what the sensor is seeing directly off of the sensor. So if you're shooting too dark or you're shooting too light, you'll be able to see that as well as see live when you're adjusting your shutter speed or aperture, see how that affects your image.
WYSIWYG, right? What you see is what you get. So what you see in the viewfinder, what you see on the back of the camera is what you're gonna get when you press the shutter button.
But it's not all good when they take out the mirror, is it?
No, because you're constantly feeding a signal to the screen or one of the screens if it has a viewfinder and an LCD. And that's a hit on battery life. Pretty significant. You know, these cameras come in about 300 to 400 shots at a charge. You see a huge difference there when you compare it against the Nikon. So that's something to keep in mind. You're gonna have an extra battery or two in your pocket when you go out with one of these mirrorless at this price point for the day.
So let's take a look. These are very different style bodies.
They are. Let's start with the M100 since it's what we kind of picked up first and really said, hey, it's great because it's so small. Well, there are some drawbacks to that as well. I mean, you've got this little bit of a thumb grip here, but I think we both commented on the fact that it just feels hard to hold in the hand. And this texturized material here really is just plasticky. It's not even rubbery, so it doesn't offer much grip there as well. You know, I do feel like I might drop this at any moment when I'm holding it.
Yeah, especially coming from the DSLRs where you get that nice beefy grip. Not having anything to catch your front fingers makes it, yeah, I would not shoot that thing without having some kind of wrist strap on.
Yeah. Now another kind of concession they made to get into this really small size is the number of buttons, physical buttons that are on this camera. But it's a Canon, so it is not only a articulating or a flippy screen, but it is touch sensitive as well completely. You can navigate menus, you can operate the camera. And you know, I mentioned the Canon part of it because they've done these touch screens really well for a while now. It's very friendly to use. It's not as fast as dedicated buttons on the camera, but it's easy enough to use that I wasn't unhappy with using it. Yeah.
It's also pretty intuitive. You know, if you want to change something, you just click right there and you get to it versus trying to figure out which button does what you're trying to get it to do.
Yeah. Now this model at this price point is really lacking something that I like, and that's a viewfinder.
Yep.
No viewfinder on here. The little pop-up thing over here that you might be seeing is just a flash. I don't even know how to make it pop up because I don't use that way. I don't use the flash so much. So that can really limit. I took some of these cameras with me on a Yellowstone winter workshop last week in a snowy landscape with the full noon sun. It was extremely hard to see what was on just the LCD. And so the cameras without a viewfinder, those were challenging to use in those conditions.
Oh, I bet. So, I mean, we've talked about the ergonomics of this thing, but does it take a good photo utilizing that APS-C size sensor in there?
It does. You know, this is the 24 megapixel Canon sensor. It's very similar to the Nikon D3500. Very good across the board in image quality. Now, another drawback in mirrorless in general typically has been autofocusing capabilities because it has to do it on the chip along with all of the image sensor capabilities as well, whereas DSLRs have a dedicated brain for that autofocus. So I was a little worried to see how these would stack up, and well, some of that worry was true. The Canon, you know, it's got great dual pixel autofocus. I'm spoiling part of your review right now on the video side of things, but you're also relying on that for photos and for anything kind of moving faster, tracking subjects, it starts to lag a little bit. It's not terrible, but it certainly starts to lag a little bit.
So even with that 6.1 frames per second burst, you know, it doesn't matter how fast it shoots if it doesn't shoot in focus.
Yeah. Yeah, only if your subject is moving, you know, perpendicular to your lens.
Yeah.
Or is it parallel? I don't know.
No, it'd be perpendicular.
Across.
You got it, you got it.
Okay, good. Video side of things?
So the Canon surprised me. I love the image quality that came out of it. The 1080p video looks sharp, it looks colorful, and then it also has that image stabilization that helps fight your handshake, and it makes a big difference on a camera like this because without a nice grip to hold on to it, you're kind of shaking a little bit more. Yeah. And so having that image stabilization in there really helps kind of compensate for that. The flip screen as well also makes it a lot easier to take selfie videos or to get really low and shoot videos. So that makes it nice and
Do you do
easy.
a lot of selfie videos?
I do not. Toby shooting the ground right there.
Trying to figure out your camera settings.
I'm always the one
Some
behind the
people
camera
do.
shooting you. Yeah, but I mean, if you're out vlogging,
I do.
and you're out somewhere, yeah, you can easily do that versus just kind of guessing and then watching the video afterwards. The touchscreen as well really helped out with the autofocus, so you could easily select a point that you want to focus on, and it just really made everything speed up. I really enjoyed this. The only thing I would kind of worry about would be perhaps future lens selection, because this is what, Canon's third mount that they're trying to support. But since it is Canon, you have all the old EF lenses, so.
Right, yeah, so this is the EF-M mount that it uses, but with an adapter you can throw on EF-S and EF glass. Of course, it's going to get a lot larger and it might not feel quite as balanced nicely with that larger glass, but that's a lot of lenses that are available to you. And they have said they're gonna support this. We'll see where it goes over the next couple of years as this kind of top of the line or the full frame mirrorless shakes out. This guy, you know, and these are both mirrorless. That's a similarity, but
this
then
one's so much bigger.
it's a lot bigger. Panasonic went a bigger route with this. Ergonomically, how did it feel, Kaz?
This, I would say, is a lot closer feeling to the DSLRs in terms of the grip that you get. So you get this nice kind of handheld grip right here, and it's got this nice cut so your middle finger kind of sits in there as well. This, I feel like if I was on a roller coaster, this is not flying out of my hand. And having this flip out touchscreen as well can be very, very handy, since it also does this fully up and down articulating action too.
Yeah. If there's a way to kind of set your photos aside from the average Joe, you know, it's to get at a different angle, and having a fully articulating screen not only makes video more useful, but it also is nice for photos as well.
Also, since it is a little bit bigger, we get a little viewfinder here as well.
That's nice. That is an electronic viewfinder in there. It's going to give you what you see and a real-time preview. It's also nice shooting video, I imagine, in brighter conditions.
So if you're shooting video and it's too bright or there's too much glare on this screen, you can use the digital viewfinder right here to be able to look at your image and pretty much just cut out all of the other ambient light, so you can really just zoom in and zone in on what you're shooting.
Yep.
So one big thing about this camera that kind of separates from that besides the size is the smaller sensor size. Now, does that play any role in the quality of photos that this thing takes?
Generally, you know, if we're speaking in very general terms, typically the larger the sensor size, the better performance you're going to get, the more detail in the shot, and especially in lower light, the less noise you're going to get with larger sensor sizes. So I was a little worried. This is the Micro Four Thirds. It's on the smaller size. It's fantastic. It does really, really well. It hangs right there with the APS-C size sensors on up through ISO 3200. And a benefit of that smaller size is you don't need bigger lenses. This is this nice little kit lens on here. It's tiny, 14 to 42. And I just, to illustrate kind of the size you might be thinking of down the road, here is what is equivalent of a 90 to 400 millimeter lens for a Micro Four Thirds camera versus a 70 to 300 millimeter lens for APS-C or full frame sensors. And so this weighs over a pound more. My point here, that as you add lenses to this system, they're going to be able to stay, your kit is going to be able to stay small and portable. So if that's important to you, this has another strength. And also, this is a kind of a Micro Four Thirds general format. There are so many lenses out there available. And again, because they're small, less glass, many of them are quite affordable as well. Another thing that I like about this camera is the number of dedicated buttons and customizable buttons that they offer on here. I think there's something like 5 customizable buttons, plus a dedicated button for everything, and dual dials. This is one of the few cameras, and we didn't see this on the DSLRs despite their larger size, that allows a dedicated dial for shutter speed and aperture control, just making it that much more manual friendly. And they've thrown in a couple little bells and whistles like integrated time-lapse mode, an integrated stop-motion mode that gives you a little onion skinning. It really doesn't feel like they held back, and I'm impressed at this price point.
I would completely agree. When it comes to not holding back, their 4K video, 30 frames per second, looks great. And I would highly recommend, if you are thinking about getting into video seriously, that you would try out 4K, because 4K scaled down to 1080p looks a lot better than video just shot at 1080p. So in that regard, image quality that comes out of it for video is awesome. Having this flip screen as well being able to shoot high and low really makes it a lot easier to capture video. And as we said earlier, this electronic viewfinder can allow you to make sure you can check your video file and footage, even if it's not the ideal conditions outside. It's not all perfect though. I will say that the autofocusing system wasn't as good as the Canon's. It didn't quite always hit the mark, and when it did hit the mark, I would oftentimes see it just bounce a little bit past where it was supposed to go, and it just wasn't as fast or as responsive.
Yeah, you say Canon, you're specifically talking about the M100.
The M100.
That dual pixel autofocus, they do that so well.
Yeah.
Panasonic uses a different technology. It's just not quite there. I was a little concerned about that on the still side of things for autofocus as well. And I have to say I was pleasantly surprised. It was good enough. It wouldn't be my first choice for fast action or sports, but for general photography, on the photo side of things, autofocus was fine.
I will also say for video shooters, this also has a microphone jack in and a hot shoe on top. So if you wanted to experiment with shotgun microphones or wireless lavaliers, you can plug one of those guys in and then mount it right up here on top to try experimenting with getting different types of audio quality coming into the camera. And then if you are doing a vlogging style system and you have a shotgun microphone on top, then this flip out to the side screen is very useful since it will not be obstructed by your microphone. So you can still get good audio quality and still make sure your shot's in focus.
You can capture those roller coaster screams in high quality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
2 mirrorless cameras, 2 very different body styles, 2 different sensor styles. Which one would you pick?
You know, despite that smaller sensor, despite some of the little quibbles with autofocus, just the full feature-packed and decent performance of this Lumix makes it my pick. Kaz?
For me, it has to be the Lumix G7 as well.
Let's move on to some point and shoots at this price point now. I want to take a moment and thank our sponsor, Squarespace.com. You know, it doesn't matter what camera you're out there shooting with. It could even be a smartphone. I hope you're not relying on social media as the only place to display your beautiful images. You need to have a place that is your own, and Squarespace's easy drag and drop interface makes it ridiculously simple to build a beautiful website and do it really quickly without any worry about spam issues or bots attacking you or DDoS attacks. It just works very nicely. And what's most important is it is your place to display your work. And if you get stuck putting something together, Squarespace is awesome. 24/7 tech support is there to help you. So in 2019, take some time, build your own place to display your own work that you have control over. And if you start at squarespace.com/photorectv, you can save 10% off your first purchase. Link is right down below this video. We thank them so much for their sponsorship. All right, first up, we've got the Canon SX70HS. This is a 20 megapixel with a standard point and shoot size sensor that's about a 1/2 inch. It is capable of 10 frames per second. It does 4K video at 30 frames per second as well. And it has a massive zoom lens built in, equivalent of 21 millimeters to 1365 millimeters. That's basically a 65 times zoom lens. Now looking at the Fujifilm XF10, we've got a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor in here. It does 6 frames per second. It does 4K video as well, but only at 15 frames per second. And we have a fixed lens. This is equivalent of a 28 millimeter f2.8. But you look at this camera and its defining feature has to be the fact that we've got that larger sensor in it, but it is truly a pocketable point and shoot.
So Toby, we've looked at DSLRs and we've looked at mirrorless cameras, and I know this is a photography channel. Why would I ever want a camera that's all in one, no interchangeable lenses?
Well, you know, they say the best camera is the one that you have with you. And there may be strong reasons that you would take one of these out of the house as opposed to a bag full of, you know, other gear. You especially see that in the case of the Fujifilm XF10. You know, typically point and shoots are smaller and lighter than their counterparts. This one's starting to get a little bit heavier than some of the mirrorless that we looked at, but of course it is supporting a massive amount of range. So it's really about, in a lot of ways, trading convenience for flexibility when you go with a point and shoot. Want to start talking about this Canon first since it's already in my hand?
Yeah, let's take a look at it. It kind of looks like a miniaturized DSLR in many ways.
Yep, I agree. And if you're comfortable with Canon or if you've ever shot with Canon, this camera's going to look and feel very similar in the hand with a lot of the same buttons and commands and layouts. And I have to say it does a pretty nice job. It gives you a fully articulating screen. It's not touch sensitive, but it's there and allows you to do the selfie photos or videos. We do have a viewfinder as well. And we've got a full mode dial here with even custom functions. So while this is a point and shoot, it is a fairly kind of customizable point and shoot, and of course gives you a ridiculous range that you can walk out the house and, well, it's not going to fit in a pocket. It could fit in a jacket pocket maybe, or at least a small camera bag, and it's going to allow you, I mean, if you compare this range to what you would need on a DSLR.
To get all of that range, you're talking about carrying around 5-6 lenses.
Yep, yeah, a huge amount, and not only that, but they're going to weigh as much as a baby.
Yeah.
A chubby baby. Sorry, chubby babies out there.
So we do have a smaller sensor in there though, much smaller than anything we've looked at so far. Now, do the photos stack up against the competition?
Well, you know, in good light, there isn't a huge difference until you start to really kind of zoom in, and then you see the loss of detail. As that light level drops though, you don't need to zoom in to see a difference. It's significant, several steps behind as you get to those higher ISOs where very quickly it becomes unusable.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like this kind of camera package would be very good for somebody who needs to take pictures that range from wide to very, very narrow. Like if you're on safari, or if you want to get some nice animal photography and you don't want to carry around 25 pounds of gear.
There are more expensive versions of this. If you spend $1,000 or even $1,500, you can get better performance in kind of an all-in-one. But at this price point, you know, you're kind of limited in that lower light performance. How about on the video side of things?
The video side is pretty cool, I'd say. It does 4K. 4K at 30 frames per second. I will say, however, the 4K didn't look that great for me. It was a little bit soft, and the colors and the contrast just really weren't there, especially when you compare it to the G7. The zoom, since this is a motorized zoom, it is not suitable for video though. When you start to zoom in and zoom out, that thing shakes your entire image. So, I mean, if you're quickly zooming into something, it's fine, but don't expect to get a nice, smooth zoom in on something.
Yeah. When I rattle off the specs, I mentioned 10 frames per second. That's nice, but if you're shooting the RAW plus the JPEG or just the RAW, that 10 frames per second, that buffer fills up pretty quickly. And the autofocusing tracking, especially as you get out to the longer zoom focal lengths, I wasn't very impressed with it. So, you know, you got to take that with a grain of salt. On paper, 10 frames per second looks better than pretty much anything else we've talked about today, but it doesn't really keep up with the focus.
So one other major standout feature about this camera is the ridiculous length. So 1365 millimeters is extremely long.
Yep.
So this guy does have stabilization in there as well. Now, did you have any problems stabilizing the image while shooting at that extreme telephoto end?
Well, I mean, when you really zoom out to that, it's very difficult to get your subject, to find your subject. And there's some framing helping. You can assign these buttons on the side to assist with that, but it becomes difficult. But you know, you don't have to go straight to 1300. You stop at 600 or at 800 and you can get, I think, a slightly better picture, and focusing and kind of stabilization stays better.
Yeah, I'll say the same thing about the video as well. When shooting wide, the image stabilization works really well. And then about halfway through, it still works pretty well, keeping the image nice and stable. But once you get to that extreme telephoto side, even on a tripod, just the inherent shake in the ground shakes the image. And if you're trying to track something, like I was trying to track a moving boat, you can see the image stabilization actively kind of fighting what I was trying to do. And so you can capture video, but you know, if you're gonna try to capture birds in flight with this, all the way zoomed in, it's going to be pretty shaky in that video.
Yep. Now I noticed that it does offer a mic jack, which does that make you happy?
I love the fact that it has a mic jack that has expandable audio options, but where are you gonna put the mic?
That's a good question. There's no hot shoe up here.
No shoe. So if you're going to be shooting with this
and let it dangle?
Yeah, you could either let it dangle, your lavalier dangle, shotgun aimed at the ground, Or you could get a nice little L bracket that comes out and comes up, and then you can mount your microphone there. So, I mean, it's a nice touch because it allows for that option, but just go in there knowing that, you know, you're going to have to buy an additional piece of hardware if you want to mount that microphone to this camera.
And then it becomes a little less portable in that case as well.
Exactly.
Talking about portability, I think we can move on to talk about the XF10 from Fuji. Now, you know, I included just kind of a mix of cameras in here. This is not one that I think either of us would recommend as your first camera or your first camera at the $500 price point. But maybe if you're already a Fuji shooter and you really like that kind of the film emulations that they give you and they like some of the style of Fuji and you want something to be able to carry around when you don't want to carry around your bigger camera, I mean, you have to give them props for packaging an APS-C size sensor in what's something that can fit in my back pocket quite easily. And with a pretty nice fast lens.
Yeah, 28mm f2.8.
But it is fixed at 28mm f2.8. So if you're not comfortable, you haven't shot at a fixed lens or a fixed focal length before, you might find that to be a bit frustrating at times to be that. And they offer digital zoom, but that's the same as cropping in post, so
exactly.
I wouldn't do it. You know, we had some complaints about the M100 being really small and hard to grip. Is it any better here?
Yeah, so this guy, in addition to that thumb grip that the M100 has, this one also has a nice little arch and a rubberized grip on the front of it too. So your front fingers do have something to grasp onto.
Yeah.
So it's still, I mean, I wouldn't trust this thing not to fly out of my hands, but I definitely feel like I have a much better grip on it than I did on the M100.
A decent mix of buttons, and it even actually gives you a focus point joystick on the back, which I appreciate. I mean, it is touch sensitive as well, and dual dials again, even though we have this very small setup similar to the Panasonic. Overall operation of this camera is quite good. You just have to get beyond or just have to understand the fact that you're gonna be walking around with a fixed lens. Image quality wise, very, very good. It's an APS-C size sensor here. It's a nice sensor from Fuji. I was impressed with it. It looks good. And again, you have those nice Fuji film simulations that just give you really kind of nice black and white options if you want to shoot that way. Some of the different chromas and colors. Very nice. Video side of things?
Yeah, for video, I mean, this thing does 4K at 15 frames per second, and so it kind of looks like an old-timey movie. So 1080p at 30 frames per second and 60, it looks fine. Once again, playing with that fixed focal length, it's a little bit difficult to deal with because you can't zoom in. It's not very adjustable. Also, this guy does not have a flip-out screen or tilty screen, and so without a viewfinder or anything, you're limited to just this screen. So it can be a little bit difficult to try to orient yourself to get that perfect shot.
Yeah, yeah. Autofocusing capabilities, single shots just fine, but when you start to track, I think this offers 6 or 7 frames per second. It really starts to lack though in the tracking capabilities. Again, I think, you know, why would you buy this camera to track anything? If it's like a tiger running towards you, what's gonna eat your arm off before you get a couple of pictures out? So, you know, that's not why you're buying this camera. You're buying this camera to go out with your friends and have a nice night and not have to worry about carrying a big camera along, but something that's gonna give you significantly better performance than your smartphone.
Yeah, it definitely feels like this is meant to be like a secondary camera to a seasoned shooter. Somebody who understands what the 28 is and understands how wide it is and where they would use it. And they just want to get good photos. You know, I could see that as you were saying when you're out with friends or you're trying to do street photography, something like this could be very unassuming.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. That was a look individually at each of these cameras. I think what we need to do now is put them all back out on the table and rank them.
Yeah. So Toby, we have them all lined up. What is your absolute favorite camera for photography and your least favorite?
Well, you know, there are a lot of these cameras that I'd be pretty happy using on a day-to-day basis, but if I had to put these in order from my most favorite to my least favorite, which is what you're asking me to do right now,
I am.
I would do this. As a photographer, it's hard not to pick the Nikon D3500 as the top camera. I mean, just that sensor performs really well. It's got a capable autofocus system in it that made me happy. 5 frames per second is a fairly versatile system. And of course, you have access to a huge number of Nikon lenses. I think you got the impression we both really like this Panasonic G7 a lot. It does have that smaller sensor, but I saw its performance is excellent. It stays small and portable, and it feels like they made no sacrifices to get to this price point. I'm just really happy with the overall performance of this camera. The M100 without a viewfinder is somewhat limiting, but it is a great image quality I saw out of this. The articulating or the tilting screen at least offers some kind of flexibility and usability there. And again, you've got access to tons of Canon lenses, either the EFM or then through the adapter. It's a little sad to put this at this end of the range, but it feels like Canon really was like, well, remove that, and that to kind of cut costs and to get it to this price point where when you look at the cameras to the left, it doesn't really feel like they made sacrifices. So just those 3 frames per second, a battery life in a DSLR that just isn't very good in this kind of eater lens. And then we get to this point and shoot. It's a great deal of kind of versatility in this, but ultimately, as somebody who has been shooting with interchangeable lens cameras over the last decade or more now, overall, I'm pretty impressed with the performance of such a crazy amount of zoom in a $500 camera, but ultimately ends up down here. And it feels mean to the Fuji to put it all the way at the end, but your specific use cases are so narrow that it just doesn't fit my kind of general travel photography, some wildlife thrown in, and so you end up all the way down there. But if somebody gave me that as an extra camera, I'd be like, awesome. Kaz, when we talk about video, how would you rank these?
So for video, this is how I would do it. Ta-da! The clear winner was the Panasonic G7 with that 4K video, the touchscreen focusing system, the portability and small lenses, the electronic viewfinder, the microphone jack, and the hot shoe. That to me just screams a video package that can be used today, upgraded, and just used into the future. Next up is going to be the Canon M100. It's mainly because I really love the picture quality that comes out of this at 1080p. The flip screen's really nice as well, and just overall it was a joy to work with, especially with that dual pixel autofocusing system. So that one I would be very happy with shooting the video, but little difficulties with getting audio in there. It's definitely a really fun, I would say, travel camera, especially at its size. Next up is the Nikon D3500. This one is just an overall strong performer with a nice autofocusing system. It is slightly held back by the fact that the screen on the back is fixed and you don't have an electronic viewfinder in there, but having the access to all of those Nikon lenses means you get a lot of room to play with when it comes to just changing things out, and for video quality, it just does a great job at 1080p. Next up is going to be this 4K Canon camera right here, and it's down here because it's good and it has a lot of range, but this dial right here is what's kind of holding it back. Yes, you use that to adjust the shutter speed and the ISO and the aperture, but once you try to focus it manually, this is your manual focus, versus on all these other cameras you have a nice focus ring to grab onto. Yeah. That for me really kills it, because if you're trying to develop as a videographer, manual focus is quite important sometimes, and that just won't cut it. Next up is going to be the Canon T6, and the fact that this doesn't have continuous autofocus is the main killer, and 1080p limited to 30 frames per second, it just doesn't do it any favors. So this one definitely feels like video is an afterthought. Last on the list, just like you, unfortunately, is this little Fuji film, and for me it's because 4K is definitely an afterthought at 15 frames per second. And then having that fixed 28mm lens on here just makes it so limiting. Looking at this lineup, Toby, where are the Sony cameras? Where are the other brands?
Well, because I'm a Sony fanboy. No, there really aren't any Sony cameras kind of on the market at this price point. The A6000, which is quite old and, does match up with a lot of these though, despite its age, still comes in at about $600. So that's over $100 more than the price point I wanted to hit, unless you talk used. If you start to talk about used gear, you can find some fantastic values. And immediately comes to mind is the older T5i. It isn't as crippled. It has that dual pixel autofocus. It has an articulating screen that very quickly would move up and can be found for about the same price. So bodies used can often offer a fantastic amount of value. So keep that in mind as well.
Take our opinions with a grain of salt. Identify your shooting situations, what you need from a camera, whether or not you need a larger sensor like an APS-C size sensor, or if something like the Micro Four Thirds is more for you. If you need to focus on photography or if you're focusing on video, we picked what we think is best for what we do. Think about what's best for you, and hopefully we're able to illuminate some more ideas about these new cameras that are out.
Yeah, but if you're still struggling with ideas, just leave those comments right down below. I'll be watching for them and answering as best I can to kind of help you out and make this decision. And links to buy all of these are right down below. Your use of those links greatly helps what we do here. And I'd also like to thank Squarespace, as their sponsorship helps out. So if you're looking to build that website, start at squarespace.com/photorectv and you can save 10% off. And I'd like to thank Kaz for appearing on this side of the camera with me.
Not usually on this side. It's a bit awkward not being able to monitor those levels.
But you've done a great job. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you.
And thank you all for watching. If you found this useful, give it a thumbs up, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.